Recently, at the virtual gathering of over 150 entrepreneurs on Startup Day, the Prime Minister said, "My government will usher in massive changes to strengthen innovation, entrepreneurship, and startup ecosystem." He lauded the startups as the backbone of New India. He listed a few things the government will do. First, liberate entrepreneurship and innovation from the web of governmental processes and bureaucratic silos. Second, creating institutional mechanism to promote innovation. And third, handholding young innovators and enterprises. The above, as reported in the press, is beautiful music to our ears and paves the way for India to attain its rightful place in the world as top-ranking economy and a prosperous country. Interestingly, the PM's statements resonate and align to the findings of a recent World Bank study, which says that the factors such as trust among people in a society, efficient judicial system, clear property rights, and effective government are all intangible capital which boost productivity of labor and result in higher total wealth. The World Bank report adds that human capital and the value of institutions as measured by rule of law constitute the largest share of wealth in virtually all countries. In the above backdrop, since the union budget is a critical policy document, one truly wants to seek the best from this policy document. I take the liberty to make suggestions for the budget to align with the action plan set out by the PM, which would demonstrate with resolute firmness the decisions and the direction that the policies of the government will take. First, let me list a few policy measures that would help. Provide long-term stable tax regime. The tax rates, policies, rules, and provisions should remain unchanged for at least 3 years, better still 5 years. This will give a stable and certain tax environment for entrepreneurs to adopt long-term growth-oriented planning for their business and not have to keep tweaking their business arrangements to align with the new tax provisions each year. Second, reforms in education sector is an urgent need. Setting up of world-class educational institutions need to be facilitated. This needs fundamental reforms in the UGC Act and the functioning of AICTE as well as UGC. Mechanism for funding the institutions for innovation and skill development needs to be created. Private sector participation needs to be encouraged and facilitated. Land allotment for educational institutions is a major challenge. A transparent system for this needs to be in place. SPAC transactions provide much needed capital for the growth of startup and other innovative companies. There needs to be a policy change to enable Indian promoters and founders to hold shares in these SPACs without attracting round-tripping provisions. Capital gains tax under explanation 5 of section 911 for sale of shares of such listed SPACs should be exempt in India. Fourth, major judicial reforms are needed to make effective justice delivery system for certainty. Currently, it takes years for any litigation to close. Justice delayed is justice denied. Fifth, taxpayer should see some benefits directly flowing to him for paying taxes. This may be in the form of clean surroundings, quick civic services, good roads, good hygienic conditions in public places, more world-class educational institutions, good healthcare system, public parks for children, etc. There is urgent need for government and local authority programs for this. Sixth, there is a fear amongst established business owners that they are being witch hunted for violation of laws for which they may not be responsible. This has resulted in exodus and flight of capital from the country. Their issues need to be discussed threadbare, and win-win solutions need to be found and implemented. Now let me turn to some tax measures. One, a significant overhaul of tax administration is needed. The income tax itself is pretty complex, and the compliances are made more complex through the administrative maze of circulars, guidelines, notifications, and internal instructions of the CBDT. Many a times, clear instructions and binding decisions are overruled, and the taxpayer faces endless litigation. The statutory provisions should be made easy enough to implement without attracting unnecessary litigation. Second, for simplification of tax compliances, some of the following would go a long way. One, there are numerous TDS and TCS provisions. The latest edition of Section 194Q and 206C1H has the distinction of being nightmarish. These sections especially are not only onerous, but are also overlapping, ambiguous, and anomalous. Even where no tax is required to be deducted due to exemption of such income from tax in India, the seller will be required to collect tax. Sale of shares also attracts this provision, which causes extremely unfriendly compliance for foreign investment vehicles who invest large amounts in AIFs, InvITs, REITs, and other infrastructure projects. Two, there are too many different rates for TDS, and that lends them to interpretation and litigation. Three, penal provisions for error in complying with these onerous provisions are far too strong, and the agent taxpayer is harassed and hassled. There needs to be a mechanism to chase the principal taxpayer rather than the withholder. A fundamental and very welcome move would be to do away with most of these TDS and TCS provisions and ensure much better compliance of advance tax for continuous revenue flow. If some TDS provisions are required to be retained, minimize the number of different rates. Another major issue that arises is for capital gains tax. There are too many capital gains tax rates, varying holding periods, and too many different ways of computing capital gains for different classes of assets. These need to be harmonized and simplified. Variable pay in the form of ESOPs is truly the backbone of the startup ecosystem. Even the traditional organizations will benefit tremendously from ESOP mechanism to reward their talent. Taxing ESOPs upon receipt of shares has put a huge dampener on the efficacy of this extremely valuable tool. At the time of receipt of shares, the perquisite is only fictitious income, and to tax it is unreasonable. The employee gets the benefit only when he sells the shares. There is an urgent need to revert to our original tax system for ESOPs. This means that while the amount of perquisite tax is determined at the time of receipt of shares, the liability to pay such tax arises only when the employee sells the shares. The tax payable would therefore include the perquisite determined when shares were given and the capital gains tax on the difference between the consideration and the fair market value at the time of exercise. Next is tax litigation. It is initiated by tax officers at almost any exemption claimed by taxpayers. Fundamental policy level change is needed in this regard. Another one is with regard to anti-abuse provisions. The three that require urgent attention are Section 5627B, angel tax. This should be repealed altogether. There are sufficient other checks and balances, both under the IT Act and in the system, to catch unaccounted money. We don't need this tax. We need free flow of funds into startup systems and into companies for the companies to grow. Application of Section 56(2)(10) and 50 CA should be restricted to shares of Indian companies only. When there are cross-border mergers and acquisitions which are happening, these two sections create significant amount of deterrence and create problems in terms of determining values for the purposes of applying these taxes. Lower rate of 15% tax for promotion of setting up new manufacturing units should be extended to firms, and thus the discrimination between forms of businesses must be removed. Last but not the least, I want to talk about the GST rates. Many of the professional services today are like medical services. They are inevitable due to complexities of law. Services as those of company secretaries, chartered accountants, GST practitioners, etc., fall under these. 18% GST on them is far too high. These services should bear no more than 12% GST rate. I hope some of these measures, in fact, all, but at least some of these measures are reflected in the budget this year. Thank you.